Natalie Doyle here, representing Forest Arts today, and we're interviewing current artists in residence doing a digital takeover, artist Megan Rudden. Hello.
Hi, hello.
How you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. So we're gonna, well, it's been a really interesting takeover so far. How have you enjoyed it? How have you found it?
Yeah, it's been great. I've really enjoyed it. It's been good to have kind of some time to go back to my work and to focus on things. So I've been back like working in my job again recently, which is like I work in like a bar restaurant, so it's like completely unrelated to art. So yeah, it was nice to have time to kind of like focus on my own work again within like a set time frame and to be able to share things with people and have that kind of like interaction.
Great. So I've done a little research, and so on your website, on your sort of artist statement, you talk about Leith and sort of the fact that you're born in Leith and now you're Glasgow based. You did your undergrad there, same as me, sculpture, environmental art, and now you're doing your MLit. So how important is the identity of Leith in your work, and how, especially with being in Glasgow, does that impact your response to site, which is a big part of your work?
Yeah, so I think working like site responsibly or site specifically is like a massive, it's really like integral to like a lot of my practice. But I think I actually started to make most work about Leith after I'd moved to Glasgow. So kind of my first year of art school, well, I went into third year after studying at college. So the project that I was doing, a lot of it was to do with like missing home and missing my family who I'm very close to and like being in this new place. But also seeing the links between like Leith as this like harbour kind of like port area and Glasgow and the like links through industry and these types of things. And then that led into my degree show work that was like really based around that relationship with that place, and specifically through talking about my granddad, who was a shipbuilder at Henry Rob's in Leith, and the kind of relationship between what I was doing now and where he was, and like where I am physically, and like how my family are also kind of like there. So yeah. Great.
Okay, well, so you've kind of touched on a little bit sort of different ways that you work, but you work across sort of many genres using many materials in a disciplinary way. Written work, obviously very prevalent at the moment. Still drawing, that's evident from your recent post of your kind of home studio. Performance, obviously a massive thing. Installation, as well as object making. So, you know, in terms of like sculpture, environmental art, I'll know I can see where a lot of those ideas have come from and where that sort of the education's come from. But obviously you've made this, obviously you've gone on to other things, but do you think that your approach has changed? And obviously to an extent it always does, but could you tell us a little bit more about how it has in the last few years?
Sure. Yeah, I think even though it might not be obvious in like the outcomes of the work, I think the approach to materials has remained quite consistent, probably for a few years, like probably since kind of leaving college time. So I tend to work in quite a conceptual way where it's like the idea comes first and then that'll sort of decide the materials and the processes. But maybe at the same time, I kind of now have built up this sort of like language maybe of like shapes and materials that I like go back to or like I use repeatedly, and they kind of like have like significance or meaning for me. So for example, like I use iron a lot, and I think that's like a material that's like already so loaded with like concept and meaning. Like it's like something that's in your body. It's very gendered. It's like necessary for healthy pregnancies. It's like at the center of the planet. It's like breaks down dichotomies between like hard and soft and organic, inorganic, like all that type of thing. So whenever I use that, I kind of like have all of the like this meaning already like embedded in it. And I think like on that same note, like I think a lot of the work I make always begins with the body in some way. And there is a way I have of working where I will start with a physical form that kind of like comes from the body, and then I'll maybe like repeat it or abstract it through maybe like drawing or making sculptural forms or even writing. So then it becomes something else, but it still holds this relationship to the body. so yeah, I think there, even though like I do work in a conceptual way where I do let the ideas decide like the way that I'm going to work, I think there is like recurring like methods of like things that I do. But I think recently my choice of materials has probably been kind of limited by like circumstances and money and like what I've had access to and that kind of thing. So like, for example, I was hoping to work a lot more with like metal this year, but obviously like you can't get access to workshops or these kind of facilities. And like before I went back to art school, I just couldn't afford to go into these places. And I think also like when you're paying for workshop time, it's like you have to have a bit more of a set idea of like what you're going to make. And I don't really work like that. Like I think a lot of the time I don't really know what I'm making until the very last minute, so it doesn't leave enough room for play maybe at times. So yeah, I think I like over the residency and I'm going to be showing like physical work at Forest Arts in a couple of weeks. I've kind of been going back to materials that I just like have at hand and like things that are here for like cheapness, but also kind of like the things I've been looking into, I feel like it sort of like makes more sense to use things from the everyday than to have like really expensive like art materials or whatever. So say like I needed paint. I realised I don't actually have any acrylic paint at all because I don't really paint. But my sister was getting rid of loads of nail varnishes, so like she's given me them. So I've just started using them instead, just to like see where that goes and to kind of like play with it and like have fun with it. So yeah.
It's quite interesting you mentioning about, because I especially thought that when I saw the drawing of the thimble, and then it made me think back to your grandmother's ball, and then now you're talking about your sister giving you nail varnish, and I'm actually, it's kind of, we'll go back to that question a little bit later on because I'm going to ask a little bit more about that, but I just think it's really interesting. It's very sort of tactile, and there's like a relationship there. Just between objects and passing them on, and again the body, and I think it's a really interesting relationship that comes through. So just talk a little bit more about your current study. So obviously you were still working in your in interdisciplinary fashion, but you know, obviously written work and language is the core of that, I guess, in a way. So what made you decide, rather than doing like an MFA for instance, what made you decide to do the MLit in this direction, and as opposed to doing something like sculpture and environmental art? Do you feel this approach of working is more liberating? Can you say more of what you want to say? Do you feel you can?
I suppose like writing is something that's always been part of my practice throughout all of that. Like even when I was studying sculpture and environmental art, I was still like writing a lot, and writing was becoming like part of the work. But I think as someone who like makes physical things and visual stuff, I was a bit like reluctant to make it become the thing. I was like a bit like insecure about the writing being like the art or something. So, but because I was so interested in writing, I was doing so much of it and it was becoming really important, I sort of wanted to see what would happen if I kind of like centered the writing in my practice. So yeah, I think like what came out of that was that I realized even when the writing was centered, like I was still making things, like still like making like physical things and still drawing and still doing all of these other things. So I think like I'm kind of trying to work out like what does it mean to be like an artist who makes these physical forms but also is very interested in writing and sees that as the work a lot. And I think like the course studying art writing has really like opened a lot of that up for me. So it's like kind of like, what does it mean if like the essays, the artwork, or like what happens if you like really push language into something like formal, like into form, to like almost like replace the physical work? Or like what happens when you do the alternative, like if you push sculpture like so far into language or something? So yeah, I think I'm trying to kind of like constantly work out what that relationship is, and if these things are like, if there's a tension between them or if they can like coexist together in the work. And like I think there are some things that are better expressed in writing, but in the same way I think there are better things expressed in sculptural forms or drawing or like visual, like purely visual images. And I think like it's important to still be able to appreciate things beyond language as well, and that like I think there's some art that can only really be like felt in that way, and to like take it into language can maybe like reduce it or make it something that it's not. So I'm really like interested in that balance. And then I suppose on the other side of it, I have recently been considering how like language can be something that can make works more accessible. So if it's kind of like used in the right way to talk around or about things, it can like let more people into the conversation. But then on the other side of that, it's also definitely something that can be used to like obscure art objects and to like remove people from the conversation. And I think like if it goes too much the other way, then it's like kind of it like moves too far into language, and then that's when like certain people are excluded because they don't have the language to engage, and then that's when it becomes problematic or whatever. So yeah, I think like there's limitations to like all of these art forms, and I'm just trying to see like where the boundaries are and like where I can push them to and like what they mean for me or something.
Okay, well, yeah, well, I'll move. I'll maybe ask you some questions later on, but I'll move on to the next question just because I think it's quite nice to lead on what we were talking about with the thimble and everything. So,
Yeah.
looking at your approach to femininity, I find it really interesting. You kind of explore the fragility, but also the strength. And what I've noticed, and I've already mentioned about like in yourself, about you casting objects like the tumble dryer ball, the rocks, the toads, and all really kind of interesting. Again, tactile, certainly in my reading of it, is kind of objects. So obviously there's more to it, but what's really interesting, and also with your post with the all the paintings and the gaze, even that when I saw it and I thought, okay, well, there's all these kind of like the witches, again, like, you know, you're talking about your family and looking backwards, and even now you're talking about the nail varnish. There's all this kind of really strong idea of like a collective female narrative. So how do you feel that your works kind of touch on and explore ideas of feminism, particularly within a Scottish society?
Sure. So I think like, yeah, it's interesting you pick up on kind of like these family relationships and these kind of links, because I think that like feminism for me is always something that I've like experienced first as like a kind of like embodied thing. So like I like experienced feminism before I had the words to talk about it or to describe it in my family. And that like my mom and my great grand, my aunties, like we're all very close. They're like incredible, like super like strong women who like completely embody like so many ideas of feminism, but maybe like wouldn't use the same language to describe it or whatever. But I think like that kind of like experience of family as being quite like a sort of like matriarchal thing for me. And I think like feminism is always something that that like coming from that and further is like something that I've experienced collectively and not as like an individual thing. So kind of the idea of these like networks of care or like communities looking after each other, like that's kind of where feminism is always like where I've seen it. So I think like, yeah, it's not something I've ever really considered as a kind of like individual pursuit. And I think the sort of like popular kind of like neoliberal, very like white feminism that we have just now is like really focused on the individual. I think it's kind of like about getting like particular women into like positions of power, and that like this representation is somehow like liberation when it's just like not. And it's sort of like really focused around like self-improvement and kind of being like this boss lady or like, you know, whatever, like that type of thing. But really like this is like a feminism that is just like so easily co-opted by capitalism. Like it's like can totally be as a brand that can like be sold back to you in like lipsticks or like face masks or whatever, which like I love both of those things obviously. But like that's kind of like is not going far enough, like it's not like radical enough. So I think like for me feminism needs to be like this collective thing that is really trying to like kind of like overthrow like the whole system really, rather than something that is about individual women being assimilated into a society that is still patriarchal, is still based on white supremacy, is still like ableist, cisgendered, and it's kind of like still focused on this idea of like a nuclear heterosexual family, and like not tolerant of anyone who doesn't fit into this. So it's kind of like I don't want that kind of like my liberation to come at the expense of others, and like I'm not really looking for like equality with men in a system that's still kind of like not made for us or whatever. So I suppose like that kind of like idea of collectivity that I've had coming from family is like, I'm really happy that you think that that seems like it's kind of like underpinning my work and like something that comes out a lot, because I think it's like, it is the way that like I would see it. And I suppose like, I think like I mentioned, say like Lola Olufemi was like one of the books that I said I've been reading recently, and I think just like she, listening to her talk like just made me like so like invigorated about like feminism again. Like I think I've really like lost hope in a lot of it, but I think like that really came from like movements that are coming from like Black feminists or women of color, and this kind of like intersectional feminism that's considering class and gender and race and all of these things. And I think like that's where like the possibilities are, and I think that is all very based on like a collective idea as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think I mean there's so many different strands of feminism, and it just it's evolved and changed, and yeah, but I think I'm absolutely with you there 100%. I think the strength in feminism is that sort of the collectiveness and the working together, rather than kind of almost at times I feel like pitting each other against one another, whether that's conscious or not. But yeah, absolutely. I think it's a lovely aspect of your work where that kind of connection in the family influence and sort of bloodline comes through. So yeah, I'm absolutely in agreement there. I think it was quite early on in your residency, or maybe even your first post, when you kind of introducing yourself and how you were going to explore this new sort of group sort of ideas of work on the back of your essay, wasn't it? Your essay was a kind of the starting point.
Yeah.
And it made me really smile when you were talking about, you know, in the past you've mopped floors and you've sang to shipwrecks. And it got me thinking, you know, how important is the idea of actions and the sort of the everyday in your practice, and also the vernacular in terms of like systems and also language.
Sure. Yeah, so I think it was really interesting that you picked up on that, because I had never really thought about like the everyday as being like a major part of my practice, but it like so obviously is. So that was something that was really, that was like very helpful for me to hear. I've not noticed it because it's like so obvious or something that it's not.
You maybe just didn't. Yeah, you need a sort of objective point of view.
So I think like, yeah, I see a lot of what I do as performance, and so in that way I think the actions are important, and even when I'm making objects, like the processes that I use, I think a lot of them can be quite performative, and then that the kind of like meaning of those processes is like held in the objects. So in that same way I think like the integrity of the actions is key to the work as well. So like it's really important for me that I make the things and that I am like part of like the process of building them or whatever that is. And that also, so like I have another series of work where I like perform fairly like mundane tasks for like a period of 4 hours, and say like one of them was like I mopped the floor for 4 hours, another one was I smiled at a camera for 4 hours. But like for me it's really important that I do the task for the length of 4 hours, like that I like go through with that duration. It's kind of like vital to the meaning of the work. So I feel like it's kind of like about like what you experience when you put your body through things, and how that kind of relates to like work and labor, and what it means to do this work in an artistic practice, and what it means to do it for like a kind of wage labor. But like all of the like the tasks or the jobs or like the work that I like make my like artwork about, like they're all jobs that I've done. So they're all like tasks that have at one point been part of my everyday. So like I'm quite like aware of like not wanting to kind of like appropriate the experience of others or whatever. So like any of the like when I'm talking about these labor tasks, it's all kind of like these jobs that I've done for minimum wage at various points. So I think like yeah, so I suppose in that way, like the performance is also like an extension of myself, and I feel like when you do these kind of like actions, you're almost like putting the work like back into the everyday or something like that, like you're putting it like back out there. So like, say like when I read the poem to the shipwreck, like it was only me that was there, and there was someone filming me, but they were really far away and they couldn't hear me. So there was just sort of like this experience that I had where I was reading this poem that had been written collectively with like people who lived in the community. Um, and it was just like me like speaking to these ships. And then I think what kind of like happens in these moments is like really interesting and important. And yeah, so maybe something about like how after these actions they sort of like feed back into that every day. And I think like when I've done a lot of performances in public places, not in art galleries, so in lots of ways it does become part of something that you could encounter in the everyday, as well as maybe being an everyday task. And I think like when I was like the mopping floors, the 4 hour performances were all to kind of like highlight the invisibility of certain types of labor. um so they were, I was doing a mundane task, but I was wearing like a pink suit and a wig, and like it obviously looked quite like out of the ordinary, but every day at the same time or something. So yeah, I think like it's a big part. And as far as the language goes, I think again, because I am really interested in kind of like my identity as being Scottish and living here, making my work here, and what that means, I think I'm very keen to like keep my like particular voice in everything that I do. So like even in my writing and stuff, like I still want it to in some way sound like something I could say or speak or whatever. Um so yeah, I think keeping that kind of like everyday language and keeping it something that is accessible is something that's important as well.
Did you find that a lot of the sort of performances you were doing, you mentioned about mopping the floor, and as someone who also likes to get in wigs and dress up, did you find that a lot of these things that you're re-exploring, were they typically jobs in labour and the kind of jobs you're doing that women typically would do, or was it kind of, how did you sort of like decide on them, and especially given the kind of the choice in your appearance and your performance?
Yeah, no, totally. I think a lot of the jobs I was talking about were kind of like service jobs, like where you were either like literally serving others, cleaning up after others. I did another one where I set up like a fake customer service desk because I used to work on a customer service desk at a shop in town. And a lot of it was kind of based around how like women's entering into labor and like kind of like women entering into the labor market, like a lot of these jobs that we were getting put into were still very low paid, and a lot of them were kind of like still extensions of like household work, or like required like huge amounts of like emotional labor, like the customer service desk, or like being a waiter, or like um these kind of like things that would usually go on in the home, and like yeah, they weren't waged, have now just been sort of transferred to these other tasks that we are still carrying out, but still for very low wages, and then maybe expected to do the same things in the home as well. So yeah, definitely there was like 100% a gendered aspect to it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go on to one question, but I'm quite just because it will kind of lead on to it. You talk about the sort of the relationship between sort of art, being an artist who writes, writing. I found it really interesting when you talked about the academy and just the kind of place in your mind and how it was just a place that existed. I thought that was really interesting. So as an extension of that, like your self-portrait with you at the gallery with the fluffy jacket and the nails, which again I think is quite nice to lead on from what we were talking about there. I feel that work, it has an equal balance of the image to the text, and that was quite obviously like a thought out outcome. So just a little bit more, I'm interested a little bit more about that. You also talk about the cultural capital and the scale, and currently where do you feel that you are on the scale, and where do you go from here as an artist?
Sure. So I suppose like where like the work like the point I'm at now, and why I've kind of like arrived at looking at these ideas of cultural capital, is that I think a lot of recent works that I was making, particularly like the ones I was saying to do with my granddad being a shipbuilder and my relationship to that or whatever, they were kind of like formed around this idea of like an older working class, and I was kind of looking at like strikes that happened in the 80s and that kind of thing. And so I suppose like in doing this, I kind of realised in some ways that was like the end of like that meaning of working class. Like that was maybe one of the last times there was like widespread sort of class solidarity, and in lots of ways like it failed. So I think that like a lot of people hold this kind of like nostalgic view of the working classes, where they think they are white and male and they are industrial workers. And I do think like my work has like questioned that to a point until now. But I think I want to kind of like push it even further to talk about like my position and where I am, and how these things have affected me. So I think I think like class is like such a complex thing, especially now, and it's becoming even more complex. And I suppose I'm trying to look to areas where we can maybe find like bigger, like more solidarity with each other or something. So like in kind of like the other side of the cultural capital conversation, like I think like the newspapers love this like kind of narrative of like, you know, if you have avocado on toast for your breakfast with a flat white instead of like, I don't know, a bacon roll and a cup of tea, then you're a different class. But like that's not necessarily true, and like that is like deliberately kind of like divisive to like make us not sort of like see each other in ourselves, and to like kind of keep us apart. So I suppose I was thinking about how our ideas of class have become a lot more about these kind of like indicators rather than maybe like economic factors. So say like I work in a restaurant as a bartender and I'm a waiter. I get paid minimum wage. I don't own any assets. I don't have I don't own my house. I can't drive. I don't have a car. I'm in like huge amounts of student debt. But at the same time, I have like certain privileges that I can use to my advantage. Like I'm educated. I have a university degree. I'm white. I have an incredibly supportive family who like taught me to read and write really early. So like I was always like extremely literate, and you know probably why my writing is so great now, because they did that, and that was like work that was put in for me, you know, at the start. I know like when to use this language and how to use it and all of those types of things. And so like kind of like recognizing how I've benefited from all of these privileges, but then at the same time, in kind of like Marxist terms, it's like essentially if you're selling your wage labor for money, like you're not a capitalist, like you don't own capital. And that applies to like so many of us. And if we could kind of like see that, then maybe there could be like this, I don't know, like if we sort of like realize we're like closer to being like homeless than we are to being a millionaire, maybe there could be like a chance at like some type of new class solidarity, like people stop voting Tory, maybe, I don't know, like that's just like the start. But I think like the far right is kind of like claiming this like voice of like the authentic working class, and I think that's something that really needs to be challenged. So I think like they as well are using this kind of like imagined like nostalgia to like separate us, and I think something that like was shown during the pandemic is that like the working class now is like largely female and mostly non-white in lots of ways, and like these are people who are like most at risk in our society. So I think like to kind of like bring it back to the work, I think like I'm kind of like constantly questioning like who my art is for and why I'm making it, and I think like more people should be able to like access art and to enjoy art, and I think like art can do things that politics and like activism can't. Like it can leave room for like more nuance. Like it doesn't have to be something that's polemic or that like takes a side. It can be political, but it can maybe just like pose questions or like leave room for thought, but also in a way that's kind of like visually exciting or engaging. And I think like that's a really important thing to like realize now, and it's very like necessary. So I suppose that's just kind of like where I was before, the type of things I'm kind of looking at, and maybe like towards where my work is going now in some ways, if that sort of answers the question.
Yeah. And just kind of like to touch on modernism as well, because I don't think I said that when I meant to. Just in terms of like kind of rejecting that and all the shortcomings that come with that. How important do you feel that kind of aesthetic is in terms of kind of challenging the sort of minimalist approach?
I think it was something that wasn't deliberate. Like that image that I shared came directly out of the essay that I'd written. So what I've been kind of like, I suppose it's kind of like questioning these like ideals we have of like what is good art, like what is like stylish and what is taste, and like I think like minimalism was one that stood out for me that was like very male dominated. Also, like, you know, if you look at like I'm like, should I say that? No, I'm not going to say that once. It's a very male dominated movement. But it's also something that is very kind of like popular now in ways of like, it's just like the way people like style their clothes or their homes or whatever. So it's had this kind of like move from like art into like, I mean, like obviously like there's minimalism in design, but it's something that's become quite like trendy and popular, and it's kind of like lost. For me, I don't think there's any like radical potential in it. I think like the objects can like look nice, but I realized that like my taste and the things that I like find appealing are often kind of perceived as tacky, and like they can often be seen as like too much and like a lot, and like I wear like fake fur coats all the time, and like just like not just because like I like them and I think the colors are fun and whatever, but like so I had this photo and I'd been writing about like these kind of movements and like what a gallery space was and the kind of like narratives like it perpetuated, and like then I just kind of had this picture of me in this like fluffy pink coat and these nails carrying a Tennent's, like pink can of Tennent's, holding a pink can of Tennent's. And then in some ways it became like a challenge to it or something, but it wasn't something that I'd like kind of set out to talk about. And I think in lots of ways, like I've not made a lot of like art that is about art, if you know what I mean. So a lot of it is very kind of like just to do with personal things, family lineages, like theoretical like ideas that I'm interested in, but not usually like art theory. And I think this is maybe the first time that I'm starting to kind of like situate my work and kind of like push against something or that's been expected or something like that, maybe.
Yeah. Oh yeah, totally. It's quite interesting. I also thought I don't know, I've recently, maybe the last 6 months or so, maybe more actually, I think the Tenants can is becoming like a more and more, I see it everywhere on Instagram, everywhere, kind of like young artists, young working class artists. So it's like a nice thing to kind of like have that and kind of see it as something that's going on. It's obviously something that's kind of close, to our like hearts in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something to look into.
I think it's just even in terms of like it's instantly recognizable, isn't it? And we kind of like equally like love it and hate it. It's an interesting thing, the Tenants sort of can, and kind of what it represents, I guess. So interesting use of that. Well, I think that's pretty much from me. Thanks for having the Q&A with me.
Thank you, that was great.
How long have you got left of your residency now? How many days?
Yeah, last day.
Last day today. Okay, great. Well, it's been really nice to talk to you and get to know you a bit more. And I'm glad to hear you've enjoyed the residency. And it's really nice to see the direction that your work's going in. And the good news that you're getting to spend extra time doing your
definitely.
So thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot. It was nice to chat.
Nice to chat too.
Okay, see you later. Bye.